The small neighborhood grocery store sat at the corner of two busy streets, a place where people from every walk of life passed through its automatic doors each day. To some, it was just another stop on the way home. To others, it was a lifeline, a place where the simple act of buying bread and milk meant survival for another week. Beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the steady beeping of scanners, countless unseen stories unfolded, quietly brushing past one another on this particular afternoon. The store was filled with the familiar rhythm of routine. Shoppers moved through narrow aisles, reaching for items they needed, their minds already drifting to dinners, bills, and the endless responsibilities waiting beyond the checkout counter. Behind one of those counters stood a clerk whose presence had become as predictable as the ticking clock above the entrance. The clerk had worked there for years, long enough to grow tired of the faces that came and went. At first, the job had been a source of pride, a step toward independence. But over time, something inside had hardened. Each long shift, each impatient customer, each moment of feeling unseen had slowly built into a quiet bitterness. That bitterness often found its way into the clerk's behavior, especially toward those who seemed weaker or less fortunate. To the clerk, people were no longer individuals with stories. They were transactions. And some transactions, in their mind, were worth less than others. The poor man entered the store quietly, as if he were trying not to disturb the air itself. His clothes were clean but worn, their fabric thin from years of use. His shoes, once sturdy, had softened and cracked with age. In his hands, he carried a small basket with only a few items inside: a loaf of bread, a can of soup, a packet of instant noodles, and a carton of milk. It was not much, but it was enough to get him through a couple of days. His face told a story that no receipt ever could. Lines carved by time and hardship marked his skin, and his eyes carried a tiredness that came from more than just age. They reflected a life that had known struggle, loss, and the quiet dignity of enduring both. He moved slowly toward the checkout, careful not to bump into anyone, careful not to take up more space than he felt entitled to. People barely noticed him as he waited in line, his gaze fixed on the conveyor belt ahead. He was used to being invisible. In many ways, it was easier that way. When it was finally his turn, he placed his few items on the belt with deliberate care. Each one felt important, not because of its cost, but because of what it represented: survival, another day, another small victory against the weight of the world. The clerk glanced at the items, then at the man. In that brief look, something cold passed between them. The clerk's eyes lingered on the worn jacket, the tired shoes, the thin wallet the man held in his hand. Assumptions formed quickly, unfairly, and without mercy. As the items were scanned, the clerk's expression hardened. There was no warmth, no simple courtesy, only a quiet judgment that filled the space between them. To the clerk, this man was not a customer deserving respect. He was a reminder of something they feared becoming themselves. The poor man reached into his wallet and began to count his money. His fingers moved carefully over each bill and coin, making sure he had enough. He had planned this purchase down to the smallest detail. There was no room for error. A single missing cent could mean going without something essential. Around them, the line grew. Some people shifted impatiently, eager to get on with their day. The clerk noticed this and felt a strange satisfaction in the attention. Power, even in small forms, has a way of feeding bitterness. The man finally held out his payment, his hand slightly unsteady. It was enough. Just barely, but enough. To him, that was a small miracle. What he did not know was that this moment, so ordinary on the surface, was about to become the beginning of something far greater. The clerk, still wrapped in quiet disdain, processed the payment. There was a flicker of something like amusement in their eyes, a sense of superiority that did not come from having more, but from feeling above someone else. In that moment, they did not see a man doing his best to survive. They saw an opportunity to feel powerful. The receipt printed, curling slowly out of the machine like a thin ribbon of fate. The clerk tore it off and placed it on the counter with a careless motion. The poor man reached for his bag of groceries, grateful that he had managed to get what he needed without any trouble. But trouble, as it often does, was already quietly waiting. Beyond the glass doors of the store, the world moved on. Cars passed, people laughed, and somewhere, life unfolded with all its unpredictability. None of them knew that inside this small grocery store, the seeds of karma had just been planted. The poor man took a step away from the counter, unaware that the clerk's thoughts were far from finished with him. To the clerk, this was just another face to forget. To fate, however, this was the beginning of a story that would soon reveal how even the smallest act of mockery could call forth the strongest response. As the man headed toward the exit, clutching his modest bag of groceries like a treasure, the store felt no different to anyone else. Yet beneath the hum of the lights and the murmur of customers, something had shifted. Karma, patient and precise, had started to move. The first chapter ends here, just as the quiet tension has been set and the forces of consequence begin to awaken, preparing for what is yet to come. The grocery store returned to its usual rhythm moments after the poor man stepped away from the counter. To everyone else, it was just another transaction completed, another customer gone. But inside the clerk, something stirred that had nothing to do with the beeping scanner or the passing line. There was a sense of lingering superiority, a hollow satisfaction that came from feeling above someone else, even for a fleeting moment. The clerk barely noticed as the man moved toward the exit. In their mind, he was already forgotten, filed away in the same mental drawer as all the other faces that passed through without leaving a mark. Yet the world had not forgotten him, and it never would. Outside, the poor man took a deep breath of fresh air. The weight of the store, of being seen and judged, lifted slightly as he stepped onto the sidewalk. In his hands, the small bag of groceries felt heavier than it should have, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. It meant he would not go hungry tonight. It meant he could keep going. He did not dwell on the clerk's coldness. Years of hardship had taught him not to waste energy on cruelty. He had learned that holding on to bitterness only made the journey heavier. Instead, he focused on the simple relief of having what he needed. Unbeknownst to him, a few blocks away, a luxury car was pulling into the grocery store parking lot. Its polished surface reflected the sky like a mirror, and its quiet engine spoke of wealth and careful engineering. The man who stepped out of it did not draw attention to himself, though he could have. His suit was tailored, his posture confident, but there was a softness in his eyes that suggested he did not measure his worth by how others saw him. This man had built his success from nothing. Long ago, he had known hunger, fear, and the quiet shame of having less than those around him. He had promised himself then that if he ever had the means, he would never forget what it felt like to be invisible. Now, he had come to this grocery store not for convenience, but for memory. It was the same place he had shopped in when he was struggling, the same aisles he had walked when every dollar mattered. Returning here was his way of staying grounded, of reminding himself where he came from. He entered the store just as the poor man was stepping outside. Their paths crossed for only a moment, two strangers passing without a word. Yet in that brief instant, something unspoken connected them. The wealthy man noticed the worn jacket, the careful way the man held his grocery bag. He recognized the quiet resilience that came from years of survival. Inside, the clerk straightened slightly as the new customer approached. Something about the man's presence commanded attention, though there was nothing loud or arrogant about him. The clerk's tone shifted, becoming polite, almost eager. Respect, in their mind, was something reserved for those who looked like they deserved it. The wealthy man placed a few items on the counter, not much more than what the poor man had bought. He did not believe in excess for its own sake. As the clerk scanned the items, their demeanor was noticeably different. There was a forced smile, a hint of deference. What the clerk did not realize was that this man had been watching. Not just now, but moments before, from a distance. He had seen the poor man at the counter. He had seen the way he was treated. Years of success had sharpened the wealthy man's ability to read people. He could sense when someone was being dismissed, when respect was being withheld based on nothing more than appearance. It was a kind of injustice that did not make headlines, but it left scars just as deep that as the transaction continued. Something inside him began to stir. He did not believe in confronting cruelty with cruelty. He believed in something far more powerful, truth. The clerk finished scanning the items, still wearing that carefully crafted politeness. The contrast between how they treated this customer and the one before was striking, though they did not seem aware of it. To them, this was just how the world worked. The wealthy man paid without hesitation. To him, money was not the measure of a person, only a tool. But he understood how easily it could distort the way others saw the world. As he took his receipt, his gaze drifted toward the door where the poor man had just left. There was something unresolved in that moment, a quiet wrong that did not sit well with him. He had spent his life proving that circumstances did not define worth. Seeing someone treated as less because of their struggles felt like a personal affront. Outside, the poor man was slowly making his way down the sidewalk, the bag in his hand swinging gently with each step. He had no idea that the universe was aligning in ways he could not yet see. Inside the store, the wealthy man stood still for a moment, letting the hum of the lights and the movement of customers fade into the background. His thoughts were not on his groceries. They were on the man who had just left, on the quiet dignity with which he had faced a world that so often overlooked him. The clerk, unaware of the storm building beneath the surface, began to move on to the next task. To them, the day was just another shift to get through, but karma does not rush. It waits, it watches, and when the time is right, it steps forward with a force that cannot be ignored. The wealthy man picked up his bag and turned toward the exit, his expression calm but determined. He was not someone who believed in chance. He believed that every moment, every encounter, carried meaning. As he stepped outside, the distance between him and the poor man was shrinking. So was the distance between the clerk and the consequences of their quiet cruelty. The second chapter closes here, as the paths of three lives draw closer, setting the stage for the truth and justice that are about to unfold. The sidewalk stretched ahead like a long ribbon of worn concrete, carrying the poor man steadily away from the grocery store. Each step he took was slow but purposeful, the small bag of groceries swaying gently at his side. He was thinking about simple things: the warmth of soup, the comfort of a quiet meal, the relief of knowing that, for tonight at least, he would be okay. He had no idea that the story of his life was about to take an unexpected turn. Behind him, the glass doors of the store slid open, and the wealthy man stepped outside. The bright afternoon light reflected off his polished shoes and well-fitted suit, but his eyes were fixed not on his own reflection, but on the man walking ahead. There was something familiar in that hunched posture, in the careful way the man held on to what little he had. It reminded him of his own past, of the days when every purchase had felt like a gamble. He began to walk in the same direction, not with urgency, but with quiet intention. The city moved around them, unaware that two lives were being drawn together by something more than coincidence. Cars passed, horns blared, and people hurried by, each wrapped in their own concerns. The wealthy man thought about the clerk's behavior inside the store. The shift in tone, the difference in respect, the way kindness had been rationed based on appearances. He had seen it countless times in his life, both when he had been on the receiving end and when others had been. It was a subtle form of injustice, one that often went unchallenged because it left no visible bruises. But it left something deeper. Did he close the distance between himself and the poor man, not to confront him, but to understand? The closer he came, the more he could see the quiet strength in the man's movements. There was no bitterness in his walk, no anger, only a steady determination to keep going. At a small bench along the sidewalk, the poor man finally paused. The weight of the groceries, though light, had grown heavy on his tired arm. He set the bag down beside him and took a moment to rest, his gaze drifting across the street where people moved in and out of shops, carrying bags far fuller than his own. The wealthy man slowed, then stopped a short distance away. He did not want to intrude, but he felt drawn to this moment, to the chance to do something that might matter. His life had been filled with opportunities to give, but not all giving was the same. Some gifts were about money. Others were about dignity. From where he stood, he could see the man's face clearly now. It was lined with age and experience, but there was a gentleness there, too. This was not someone who had been broken by life, but someone who had learned how to endure it. The wealthy man reflected on how easily society labeled people. Poor, rich, successful, failed. These words carried power, shaping how others were treated and how they saw themselves. But he had learned, through years of struggle and triumph, that none of those labels told the full story. The poor man picked up his bag again, preparing to continue on his way. He did not notice the man watching him, nor did he sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Back inside the grocery store, the clerk continued their shift, unaware of the quiet chain of events unfolding just beyond the doors. The moment of mockery, the subtle judgment, had already been released into the world. Now it was moving, carried by forces far larger than a single person's attitude. The wealthy man took a breath, steadying himself. He knew that whatever he chose to do next would not just affect the man on the bench, but also the clerk who had treated him with such disdain. He believed that justice did not have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes, it was most powerful when it was calm and undeniable. The poor man stepped back onto the sidewalk. The wealthy man followed, their paths now aligned. He did not yet know exactly how things would unfold, but he trusted that doing what was right would lead them where they needed to go. The city, bustling and indifferent, continued its endless motion. But in this small corner of it, a story of karma, compassion, and truth was gathering strength. The third chapter ends here, just as the distance between injustice and its consequence grows smaller, and the moment of reckoning draws near. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the sidewalk as the poor man continued his slow journey home. With every step, the small bag of groceries bumped gently against his leg, a simple rhythm that matched the steady beat of his heart. To him, this was just another day of surviving, another quiet victory in a life that had taught him not to expect miracles. He did not know that a miracle was walking only a few steps behind him. The wealthy man followed at a respectful distance, his thoughts deep and deliberate. He had spent years learning how to move through the world with purpose, how to turn moments into opportunities for change. He believed that wealth, when used without compassion, was nothing more than another form of emptiness. And in this moment, he felt a responsibility that went beyond writing checks or funding projects. He felt the need to restore something that had been quietly taken from a man who did not even know it had been stolen: dignity. When the poor man finally reached a small, weathered apartment building, he paused once more. The stairs leading up to his door were steep, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. He took a breath, preparing himself for the climb. That was when the wealthy man closed the distance between them. The poor man turned, surprised by the presence of someone so different from the world he was used to. But what he saw was not arrogance or condescension. It was something gentler, something more sincere. The wealthy man did not approach with the intention of flaunting his success. He approached with respect, with an understanding that what he was about to do was not about charity, but about recognition. He saw in the poor man a reflection of his own past, a reminder of the days when hope had been fragile and survival had been a daily struggle. He began by acknowledging the moment they had shared in the grocery store, though the poor man had not realized it at the time. He explained, not with words here, but through the quiet weight of his presence and the careful way he held himself, that he had witnessed what had happened at the checkout. He had seen the judgment, the subtle cruelty, the way a human being had been made to feel smaller simply because of how he looked. The poor man, listening with a mixture of confusion and humility, felt something stir inside him. For so long, he had accepted the way the world treated him as a given. He had learned not to expect fairness. Yet here was someone who had noticed, who had cared enough to follow him out of that store. The wealthy man then did something that changed everything. That he did not just offer money. He offered opportunity. He had built a business empire from nothing. And along the way, he had created programs designed to help people who were willing to work but had been pushed aside by circumstance. He saw in the poor man a resilience that could not be taught, only earned through hardship. In that quiet moment outside the apartment building, he extended a hand, not as a savior, but as a partner. What he offered was a chance to step out of survival mode and into something more stable, more hopeful. The poor man's life, which had been defined by scraping by, suddenly stood on the edge of a new beginning. The impact of that gesture was immediate and overwhelming. The poor man, who had walked into the grocery store invisible, now felt seen in a way he never had before. His struggles were no longer just burdens. They were proof of his strength. As they parted, the wealthy man turned back toward the store, his purpose now shifting. The second half of Karma's journey was about to begin. Inside the grocery store, the clerk was still working, unaware that the consequences of their earlier behavior were about to arrive. The shift had gone on as usual, filled with small annoyances and routine tasks. To them, the poor man was already forgotten, just another transaction in a long line of them. But the wealthy man was not a transaction. When he walked back through the doors, the atmosphere changed in a way that was almost tangible. The clerk, recognizing the man from earlier, immediately shifted their demeanor again, offering the same polished politeness reserved for those who looked important. What they did not know was that this man held more than money. He held influence. He was a major investor in several businesses in the area, including the chain that owned this very grocery store. He had come here not just as a customer, but as someone with the power to shape the future of this place. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. Instead, he let the truth do the work that he revealed that he had witnessed the clerk's behavior toward the poor man. He made it clear that respect was not optional, that dignity was not something to be rationed based on appearance. In a world that often rewarded cruelty, he was determined to use his position to demand better. The clerk, suddenly aware of how far their actions had reached, felt the weight of reality settle in. The moment of mockery that had seemed so small now stood exposed as something far more serious. It was not just a lapse in kindness. It was a reflection of a mindset that had no place in a business built on serving the community. Consequences followed, not out of revenge, but out of justice. The clerk's behavior was addressed, their assumptions challenged, and their future in that store irrevocably changed. Karma had arrived, not as a thunderbolt, but as a mirror, forcing them to see themselves as they truly were. Meanwhile, the poor man returned to his apartment with more than groceries. He carried with him a sense of possibility that he had not felt in years. The kindness of a stranger, multiplied by the justice of another, had created a ripple that was already transforming his life in the days that followed. That ripple grew into something extraordinary. Opportunities opened. Support appeared where there had once been none. The man who had been mocked at a checkout counter began a new chapter, one defined not by scarcity, but by hope. The grocery store, too, felt the change. The lesson learned there spread quietly, influencing how people were treated, how respect was given. One moment of cruelty had been answered by a wave of accountability that in the end, the story was not about a clerk or a rich man or even a poor one. It was about the invisible threads that connect every human being, about how every choice carries weight, and about how even the smallest act of mockery can call forth the strongest force of justice. Karma had walked in that day, not with anger, but with purpose. And in its wake, it left behind something far more powerful than punishment. That it left behind change.